The following program is produced by Londonderry residents. The views and opinions expressed are not necessarily the views and opinions of the LACTV staff or its volunteers, and should not be considered an endorsement by CTV20 or its staff and volunteers.
Hello, Londonderry, and welcome to another episode of Concord Conversations, where we discuss state, county, and local issues. 1 week from today is Labor Day, and appropriately, we thought we would have the Commissioner of Labor on today. I'm joined by my co-host, Doug Thomas. My name is Wayne McDonald. We have the privilege of being state legislators representing Londonderry in the New Hampshire House, and we're delighted to have the Commissioner of Labor, Ken Merrifield, with us this morning. Ken, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely pleased to be with you.
The Department of Labor is a relatively small department, 80 employees, I think it is.
We have 87 authorized funded positions right now. We abolished 8 in the last biennium. The legislature also added a new program and gave us an additional position. So we have 87 positions. I looked this morning before coming in. We have 69 of those are filled currently, which is kind of light for us. That's a 20% vacancy rate. That's a little more than we typically carry. I would say probably 75 people is typical for us.
Okay. I used to work for Health and Human Services, which is, of course, the largest department in state government. We have over 3,000.
And of course, I worked there too.
You did. That's where we met. I believe that's where we met. Was it when you were mayor of Franklin? I can't remember.
I was mayor at the same time. We might have met through our mutual friend Tony Junta, who was
That's right.
previously mayor in Franklin.
Previous and subsequent mayor.
Yes.
But even though the Department of Labor is relatively small compared to some other agencies, it's certainly got a lot of responsibilities, and maybe you could walk us through some of those things that the department does.
Sure, happy to do that. Primarily, and I think this may come as a surprise to your audience, but the primary responsibility and the largest line of business at the Labor Department is to monitor and maintain the state's worker compensation system. So there are some 40,000 workplace injuries in New Hampshire every year. All of those have to be reported to us because of our role in the worker compensation system. Some subset of those 40,000 will eventually become worker compensation claims that are paid by an insurance carrier. And so we monitor that activity, the behavior of the insurance carriers in those cases. And then we also provide, in those cases where there's a dispute between the injured worker and the insurance carrier, we actually provide the forum for a hearing on those matters, and then we'll render a decision from the department about who's right, who's wrong, and that sort of thing. And then there's an appellate process beyond that as well. So we offer administrative support to the appellate board, the Compensation Appeals Board, who will look at our decisions and can sometimes overturn, sometimes sustain our activities.
So you get an incident that's reported to you, and I don't know what the time frame is of how long they have to report an incident.
2 years. 2 years typically. Yeah.
2-year window.
And that's the employee. Now the employer, within 5 days of being told that there's been an injury or being informed by the worker that there's been an injury, they should report that to us within 5 days. We're flexible to some degree with that. We don't typically impose penalties on the employer if they exceed that by a bit.
So you get notified. Can you run us through the process quickly as to what happens after you get notified?
Sure. If we're notified through what's called a first report of injury, employer's first report of injury, if we're notified of that, we may never hear anything else about that case because it's bandage and, was a cut, never develops into anything, or, it may be more serious than that. The worker may lose time out of work, and so their income has to be replaced by what we would call indemnity payments from the insurance carrier. Also, their medical expenses have to be covered by the insurance carrier. So it may or may not develop into a case that we have to monitor.
When I was in the private sector, I used to oversee the filing of accident reports.
Sure.
And it was a manufacturing facility with saws and all kinds. It was quite a while ago. It was back in, I left that company in the 90s, but I always remember the importance of filing, and sometimes people wouldn't even tell us right away, which made the injury and in terms of where it occurred suspect also. But it was quite a process. I dealt a lot with David Wibby back then. He was deputy commissioner.
Yes.
In terms of you mentioned the appellant process and
Yeah.
so forth, and I know a lot of employers, particularly if they're cited for any kind of violation, whether it's flagrantly filing late accident reports or whatever, the initial fine seems steep, and maybe you could walk us through that side of it, and the fact that the fines often are negotiated down, and they're not really as punitive as some people might think.
Sure. Yeah, I think what you're describing, Wayne, is probably more on the wage and hours side, as I've been talking about the workers' compensation part of our building. That's our largest division, but we also have responsibility for enforcing various types of employment law. So are people being paid by their employer on time? Are they being paid in full? We had discussion before coming on about tip sharing and tip pooling in a hospitality environment. There are very specific laws in New Hampshire about that, and employers will sometimes get into trouble, will be brought in based on a complaint by a worker. So we'll be brought into the environment to look at records to determine whether the employer has met their obligations under New Hampshire law. Now, in the event that we do discover violations, in most circumstances, the commissioner has the authority to impose up to $2,500 per violation, which can really run into an awful lot of money. We don't typically use the entire $2,500. It's more like on a first offense, it's more like $100 per violation. And that's not in every case, just a fairly typical case. However, before moving that case to, let's say, a formal hearing circumstance where the department would be a party and the employer would be a party, and we would argue our case before a hearings officer at the department, typically the division offers the opportunity for what we call an informal conference. And the vision there, the thought is that what we really are hoping to get is the employer to acknowledge, okay, that is the law. We shouldn't have handled those circumstances that way. We are going to operate differently in the future. Here's evidence that I'm trying to comply and get back to square one. In that case, we'll negotiate the civil penalty.
So they have to come up with a corrective action plan?
Yeah, in a sense, that's a way of thinking about it, sure.
Okay.
Since you brought it up, I'd like to take a slight side trip here. You mentioned tips. And so, as we learned earlier before we went on the show, the law has changed involving what you call tips and what you call service charge. Can you explain that and how that works now?
Yeah, previously under New Hampshire law, a service charge was considered to be a tip and was really, and this is still the case with tips, the tips are the property of the person receiving it, and so employers cannot coercively direct or a redistribution of that money. It's a gift from a customer to a server in most instances. And a service fee was considered the same in the past, but New Hampshire, the legislature has recently changed that law to say that the service fee is not the property, is not equivalent to a tip. and that that can be directed how the employer sees fit.
Did we vote for that, Doug? I don't remember.
I don't remember, I'd have to know the bill number, but that begs a question in that now on your receipt, they could choose not to put the word tips on there, they could choose to put the word service charge or service fee. And the different, in some cases, like we discussed earlier, large events like banquet halls, that may be a justifiable expense because they have to bring in extra equipment maybe or extra security or whatever it is, that could fall under service fee. But now, if you're a smaller business, you can say service fee and then the employer collects it and they can distribute the money however they choose to the employers. Their policy may be equal, their policy may be, no, you get it all, or maybe we keep some, so now it becomes very varied on that.
Yeah, I can see that being a potential problem. As I say, the tipping statute in New Hampshire is very clear that a tip is the property of the server.
A tip is a tip.
The person receiving the tip is the owner of that tip. And where a lot of, this is a hot topic for us, unfortunately, at the Labor Department, because a lot of employers believe that they can direct how those tips are distributed. Everyone turn in your tips at the end of the night, and then we'll decide who gets what. That would be illegal under New Hampshire law.
And if it's a cash tip, how do they even know what
Well,
necessarily?
that's
if
fair.
it's written at the bottom of a receipt with a credit card, of course, it's different. But
Right.
and I guess if the individual, if the patron wrote the amount of the tip down that he's giving, even if it's cash, I suppose that's another thing. But oftentimes that's not done.
It's possible that they could be charged a service fee and then the customer may give additional money for a tip. And there, in some cases, might be double tipping.
Nah.
Don't know.
Fair, right? So another topic that I wonder if I could bring
Sure,
up. That's essentially, those two divisions are essentially the function of our department. But there are a lot of things that people call us about that are not our responsibility and actually land in other places in state government. And I love to take these opportunities when talking with the public to explain some of that. I think you may have recently had my mentor, George Kapadas from Employment Security.
Actually, Brian Gottlob.
Oh, yes.
He
Yes.
substituted for George. George was away that day, but.
Understood. But we get an awful lot of calls from, and even from legislators, by the way, relative to unemployment payments and that whole system, which really has nothing to do with the Labor Department. I know it says labor over the door and everything, but we actually don't have anything to do with the unemployment system. I believe historically, employment security was a division of the Labor Department, but it became such a big operation that the legislature split it off and made it its own department to the point where now I think Commissioner Kapadas has something like 300 positions compared to my
I think
my
300 or 400,
87.
yeah.
Yeah, and during the pandemic, I mean that department was really under the gun and had a lot to do. One of the other areas that we get a lot of questions about is discrimination in the workplace. And apart from a couple of really specific examples there and also rare examples in the law, we have responsibility for those, but typically any sort of discrimination based on age or race or any protected class, those sorts of discrimination claims are actually investigated and handled by the Human Rights Commission. But we receive, folks will call us because it says labor. Oh, and also workforce issues. Connecting people unemployed with jobs and the unemployment rate and all of those sorts of things that have to do with the labor market and developing the labor market. We don't have a big attachment to those efforts. It's more employment security and to some degree, business and economic affairs.
I can only
also.
imagine that when you tell people this, when they call, they'll say, what do you mean? You're the labor
Yeah,
department.
yes, yes, yeah.
Well, at the
and
national level, all of that is under the
You're
Department
right.
of Labor, right?
You're right. Here in New Hampshire, it is a bit more fragmented. As I say, employment security, I believe, if my history is correct, I believe it was a division of labor, but moved out to be its
It's
own
interesting you
department.
mention that. We've all been around state government for quite a while, and there was a guy named Ben Adams who was I believe, the first Commissioner of Employment Security, appointed by Governor Wesley Powell back in the late 50s, early 60s, and he was there for a long, long time. He was kind of, Dick Flynn was well known in safety for being there a long time. Ben Adams was like the Dick Flynn of employment security, and I think he was one of the, he made it such a fiefdom, as many department heads did over the course of our time, our history. I think that's one of the reasons it probably broke away, it was able to break away. I think he probably exerted some influence there even before he was commissioner.
So
Interesting.
I was going to ask, moving forward now, though, what do you think in New Hampshire, what would be your top 2 or 3 concerns moving forward involving your entire department?
Concerns. Well, I think something that is worthy of some discussion and study, our budget is, the governor has given us a $12.1 million target. So the operating budget has been, in my time, has been anywhere from 10 to 12 million. We also have management of a very, very little known revolving fund that it has been as big as 20 million. And it really just depends on the number of insurance carriers participating in this pool. There's no state money. It's not an operating fund of the department. Carriers pay in, carriers take out, and so it's a true revolving fund. But the size of that worries me to some degree, because it's literally can be double the size of my entire operating budget.
Wow.
So that's one thing. I think also, tip pooling has been a really hot topic. I think employers are in some cases under the mistaken impression that they can manage and direct tip pools and tip sharing to a degree that they probably should not be under New Hampshire law. The other thing that I'd mention too, because I have some friends who have started businesses in New Hampshire, and they appeal to me for different sorts of advice. Something that everyone should be aware of if they are starting a business and they're going to have one employee, even one employee, you have to have worker compensation coverage. Have to have it before anybody.
Didn't it used to be you start off at 3 employees or something?
There's a very limited exception in the law when you're like a managing partner of an LLC. You can exclude up to 3. It's such a rare thing that people will use the exclusion. But it's a very, very distinct and fine distinction. Broadly speaking, if you're opening a business in New Hampshire, you really should have workers' compensation coverage if you have a single employee. And part of that is the great grand bargain that was struck in, I believe, is the early 1900s between employers, the insurance carrier, the legislature. They said, all right, we're going to bar an employee who gets hurt at work. We're going to bar them from suing the employer if they have workers' compensation coverage. So an employee who is injured at work does not have the right to pursue a legal claim against their employer if there's insurance coverage. And it's the law. You have to have workers'
No
compensation.
matter what the level of the insurance coverage is?
Well, they're going to issue the policy based on the number of employees.
So yeah, that'll be determined by the insurance carrier.
Right.
Okay.
So,
Right, exactly.
so along those lines, I know every time I go to my doctor, my clinic, for even just a follow-up or just something very mundane.
They
One of the
ask
first questions they ask me is this work related or work, how do they fit into this formula of notifying labor?
Maybe your next guest will be the insurance commissioner.
Okay.
That's a good idea. That's a good idea.
My belief is that for doctors and hospitals, medical facilities, worker compensation is more lucrative than other types of payment. And this is borne out in the data that we receive from the National Clearinghouse on worker compensation data. They tell us that New Hampshire, in fact, stands out a little bit in terms of the rate of payment for worker compensation medical fees. That our fees are greater than what the same facility would receive for Medicare. And so I think, and again, the insurance commissioner probably a better source of information than me on this, but I believe it's a more lucrative avenue for payment.
Yep. Well, they sure ask you that question every time.
Yes.
Well, I know. Well, good. Well,
And another thing that the department does, and I don't know what division of the department does this, but an elevator inspection.
Oh,
although,
yes.
That's part
Rather
of it.
famously.
Any of you out there listening, if you've ever been in an elevator, you're going to see Ken's name signed on the wall there, along with the deputy Rudolph.
Rudy Ogden has moved about a year ago,
Okay.
left the department. He is currently the governor's attorney.
Oh,
And has been nominated to be a Superior Court judge.
oh, okay.
He
He found that preferable to being deputy commissioner. Or?
You know, he says he would stay forever. You know,
Okay.
he wasn't in any rush to leave the department. And a tremendous guy. Rudy's really wonderful. But he's been replaced by an equally capable person. Danielle Albert is now the deputy commissioner and doing a fantastic job. But to your point though about elevators and boilers and pressure vessels and that sort of thing, I'm often asked, you know, like, Labor Department, you don't do employment security, you don't do, you know, discrimination
Right.
claims, but you do.
That sounds like they had to put it somewhere, so they gave it to you, I guess.
I have a theory about this. I have a theory why elevators and boilers. If you think back, our department is one of the oldest departments in state government, and I think if you think back to an earlier era, the only place that you would really find elevators or commercial boilers, we have nothing to do with residential boilers, it's just commercial sized boilers. The only place that you really find that would be in a commercial or industrial setting back in the day. And so if those devices failed, you would probably be injuring or sadly killing employees. And so I think that's why the Labor Department has this purview over elevators and boilers. Interestingly, I have counted the number of states that do this like this. New Hampshire is not an oddity in this respect. 26 states have boilers and elevators attached to the Labor Department. So right. I think that's why, but I wasn't around when the decision was made. So.
Well, I'd like to ask a question that I'm sure you're not directly related to, perhaps somewhere in your department. Maybe you can shed a little bit of light on the overall look of New Hampshire's labor force. We have a very, very low unemployment, yet we still hear a lot of businesses are screaming for employees, workforce, particularly in the service industry. Have you heard of anything within your department as to projections and what may
again,
happen?
is that under you or employment
It
security?
really, Brian Gottlob, who you had as
Right.
a guest, is
Right.
the guy that's most responsible
Right.
for analyzing employment
He had great
data.
projections too.
Yeah. Brian's a great economist.
right.
Known him for a long time. I would say One avenue that employers might consider that may not leap to mind with regard to workforce development is apprenticeship. And the reason I say that is because I know that the US DOL, who has responsibility for approving apprenticeship programs in New Hampshire, they have been very, very forward-looking in terms of expanding apprenticeship to different industries. I mean, we automatically think, right, about the trades, carpenters and plumbers and electricians.
Yes.
All great employment opportunities, by the way. I mean,
Yes.
some of the most successful
Very
people
much.
I know
Yes.
are in the trades. Great avenue of work for young people to get involved in. But apprenticeship has now expanded to areas like finance and healthcare and hospitality. We've talked a lot about. There are numerous industries that are now using the apprenticeship model to help connect employers and employees together. So that's one program I think that people could consider.
Interesting.
It's interesting how interconnected so many departments in the state government are, like hospitality relates to economic development and Department of Tourism. And last I knew, tourism was our #1 industry in New Hampshire. I don't know if it still is.
I think you're right.
And now that we've moved into the high-tech age quite a bit. But, obviously the tipping thing relates to that, and labor deals with employment security in the sense of employment issues and overall businesses can't function without people.
Right,
So-
right, and you're right, and we do connect an awful lot. George and I talk frequently. Taylor Caswell and I talk frequently. We have a lot of overlapping areas where we have common interests.
Yeah, the department heads, I take it, and I know we don't have a cabinet form of government in New Hampshire where, the governor sits at the head of the table with all of his department heads, but are the department head meetings from time to time? And
Absolutely.
extensive
Since
interaction?
I have only been involved at that level, of course, since Governor Sununu has been governor, but he does hold regular cabinet meetings where he calls everyone together.
Now, is
And,
that with just the department heads, or does he call in the executive council as well?
I don't remember executive counselors coming to that, but we
Okay.
do. We also have an informal group where the heads of all the state agencies are invited to gather and talk about common issues, and executive councilors have come to those meetings.
Yeah.
But those are separate from the governor's meetings,
Yes.
where he's giving us this is what you're going to do.
Okay, all right.
Very good.
Well, we've got about a minute left, actually 45 seconds. Any last thoughts you want to share, Ken, about the department? You've been commissioner how long?
7.5 years.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
great, that's
Yeah.
great. And obviously you like the job.
I do. It's wonderful. It truly is the best job I've ever had in my life. And I just want to assure your viewing audience that we are there to help. So whether you're an employer who's looking to learn more about employment law or worker compensation, or you're an employee who thinks that something may not be right in your workplace, something like that, we're there to help. Not really, don't really have any desire to punish, but more to instruct and educate. So.
It's a great way to approach it. Doug, do you have any last thoughts? Or?
No, I think you've covered everything we have time for. Perhaps next time, if we have you back, we can talk about the difference between an employee and a contract worker.
Sure.
And see how that works. But that's for another subject.
Great.
Okay, well, with that, we'll wrap it up. Again, Wayne McDonald, a state representative from Londonderry. Doug Thomas, a state representative from Londonderry. Hosting today, Commissioner of Labor Ken Merrifield. Have a great week, everybody, and happy Labor Day.
program was produced by Londonderry residents. The views and opinions expressed are not necessarily the views and opinions of the LACTV staff or its volunteers and should not be considered an endorsement by CTV 20 or its staff and volunteers.